Have you ever wondered why most gardens suddenly fall silent after the first frost arrives? Why, every year, we repeat the same routine. The temperature drops, we clean the beds, store the tools, and quietly accept that the growing season is over. Why do we believe the garden must remain empty for months, simply because the weather turns cold? Have you ever stopped to question whether that assumption is actually true? Or is it simply a habit that gardeners have repeated for generations without ever thinking about it? If frost truly marks the end of the gardening season, then why are there places where people are still harvesting fresh vegetables in the middle of winter? Why are there families who bring leafy greens from their gardens to the dinner table even while snow covers the ground? What do they know that most of us do not? Imagine a late autumn evening in the garden. The sun slowly sets behind the trees at the edge of the yard. Soft golden light spreads across beds that were harvested only days ago. The air grows cooler. Dry leaves rustle gently as the wind moves through the garden. For many gardeners, this moment feels like the closing chapter of the growing season. The tools are put away. The beds are cleared. The garden looks quiet and empty. In most people's minds, the garden will remain asleep until spring arrives again. In fact, this is exactly what most gardeners do. Surveys about home gardening in North America suggest that nearly 70% of gardeners stop planting after the first frost. Not because it is impossible to grow anything after that moment, but because they believe that nothing can survive in cold weather. Yet nature often works in ways that surprise us. Some plants do not simply tolerate cold temperatures. They actually respond to the cold in ways that improve their survival. When temperatures fall below freezing, certain plants begin converting starch inside their cells into sugar. This process lowers the freezing point of the water inside those cells and helps prevent the cells from bursting when temperatures drop. In other words, the cold becomes part of the plant's survival strategy. That same process is also the reason many winter vegetables taste sweeter. A carrot harvested after several frosts can taste noticeably sweeter than one harvested in the middle of summer. If some plants truly adapt to cold weather in this way, then why do we assume the garden must stop producing food once winter arrives? That question began to change the way I looked at gardening seasons. A few years ago, I had an experience that completely shifted my perspective. It was the middle of January. I was driving through the countryside of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Snow covered the surrounding fields, and the air was cold enough that every breath formed a visible cloud. As I passed an Amish farm, I noticed something that made me slow the car down. An Amish woman was standing outside in her garden, in the middle of winter. She bent down and lifted fresh green leaves from a low wooden frame covered with an old window. There was no large greenhouse, no electricity, no heating system, only a simple wooden structure resting directly on the soil. That moment made me realize something important. Perhaps we have misunderstood winter in the garden. Perhaps frost is not the finish line we always believed it to be. Perhaps it is simply the transition into a different kind of growing season. And if that is true, then the next question becomes obvious. Which plants are actually capable of thriving in cold weather? That question eventually led me to a fascinating discovery. Not all vegetables are afraid of the cold. In fact, there is an entire category of plants that behave very differently. These vegetables do not simply tolerate cold weather. In many cases, they actually perform better when temperatures begin to drop. This idea sounds surprising to many gardeners. Most of us grow up believing that cold weather is always harmful to plants. But when I began studying how certain vegetables respond to winter conditions, I realized that some plants evolved specifically to survive in these environments. When temperatures fall below freezing, certain vegetables activate a natural survival response. Inside their cells, they begin converting stored starch into sugar. This sugar lowers the freezing point of the water inside the plant cells. As a result, the water does not freeze solid, and the cell walls remain intact instead of bursting. This process functions like a natural antifreeze system created by the plant itself. And it is also the reason many winter vegetables develop a sweeter flavor after exposure to frost. A carrot harvested after several cold nights can taste noticeably sweeter than a carrot harvested during the middle of summer. Many gardeners are surprised the first time they experience this difference. Once I understood this concept, I began looking more closely at which plants are best suited for winter gardens. One of the most common cold hardy vegetables is kale. This leafy green is remarkably resilient. Some varieties of kale can survive temperatures as low as around 10 degrees Fahrenheit and still continue producing leaves. When given minimal protection, spinach is another excellent option. Traditional varieties such as Bloomsdale are well known for their cold tolerance. With simple protection, they can overwinter successfully and begin growing again once daylight increases in early spring. Another vegetable that is less familiar to many modern gardeners is mulch, which is sometimes called corn salad. This small leafy green thrives in cold weather and has been grown by traditional farming communities for generations. Claytonia, also known as minor lettuce, is another fascinating plant. Its leaves remain tender and mild even when temperatures approach freezing. This makes it especially valuable for winter harvesting. Beyond leafy greens, there is also an entire category of root crops that perform extremely well. In cold conditions, carrots, turnips, beets, and parsnips are all excellent candidates for winter gardening. When protected properly, they can remain in the soil throughout the winter and maintain excellent flavor and texture. However, there is one critical rule that many beginners misunderstand. These vegetables are not planted during winter itself. They must be planted much earlier in the season. The ideal planting window is usually late summer or early autumn. The goal is to allow the plants enough time to establish themselves before the days become too short. Many winter gardeners refer to a period known as the Persephone period. This is the time of year when daylight drops below about 10 hours per day. When that happens, plant growth slows dramatically and in many cases nearly stops. This means the plants need to reach a healthy size before that period arrives. Once established, they can survive the winter months and simply wait for the return of longer daylight in early spring to resume active growth. Once I understood this principle, the entire concept of winter gardening became clearer. Winter is not the time when planting begins. It is the season when the work done earlier continues quietly beneath the cold air. And once those cold, hardy crops are established, the next step becomes surprisingly simple. They only need a little protection from the harshest winter conditions. That is where one of the simplest structures in gardening begins to make a remarkable difference. That simple structure is called a cold frame. When I first heard the term, I imagined something complicated, like a miniature greenhouse, but the reality is very different. A cold frame is actually one of the simplest gardening structures you can build. At its most basic level, a cold frame is simply a bottomless box placed directly on the soil. On top of that box is a transparent lid, usually made from glass or clear plastic. With this simple design, you can create a growing environment that behaves very differently from the air outside. The reason a cold frame works so well is because it captures and stores energy from sunlight. Sunlight passes easily through the clear lid and warms the soil and air inside the frame. Once the air inside begins to warm up, that heat becomes trapped within the enclosed space. This process is similar to the natural greenhouse effect. Light enters easily, but heat escapes much more slowly. As a result, the temperature inside a cold frame can be significantly warmer than the outside air. In many situations, the temperature inside can be 15 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the surrounding environment. That means on a winter day, when the outside air is around 25 degrees Fahrenheit, the inside of the cold frame may reach 50 degrees or more. That difference is often enough to keep many cold, hardy vegetables alive and slowly growing throughout the winter months. Another important factor that helps cold frames work effectively is the soil beneath them. Soil acts as a natural thermal mass. During the day, the soil absorbs heat from the sunlight. When temperatures drop at night, the stored heat is gradually released back into the air inside the frame. This process helps reduce the sharp temperature swings that normally occur between daytime and nighttime. That stability can make the difference between plants surviving or freezing. One of the most appealing aspects of cold frames is that they are extremely easy to build. The traditional versions used by many Amish gardeners are often made from very simple materials. Typically, they build a rectangular box using 4 wooden boards. The back of the box is slightly taller than the front, which creates a sloping surface for the lid. The lid itself is often an old window or a piece of clear glass. The slanted design helps capture more sunlight during winter when the sun sits lower in the sky. It also allows rain and snow to slide off the top more easily. A common size for a cold frame is roughly 4 feet by 8 feet. This provides enough growing space while still being easy to manage. However, there is one important detail every gardener needs to remember. On sunny days, even in the middle of winter, the inside of a cold frame can warm up surprisingly quickly. If the temperature becomes too high, plants can become stressed. For this reason, gardeners usually prop the lid open slightly during the day to allow fresh air to circulate. This simple step prevents overheating and keeps the internal climate stable. I still remember the first cold frame I built in my own garden. It was made from leftover lumber and an old storm window I found at a yard sale. The total cost was almost nothing. Yet that simple structure provided fresh greens from November through the early part of spring. Seeing bright green spinach leaves growing while the air outside was freezing changed the way I thought about winter gardening. A small structure like that can completely transform how a garden behaves during the cold months. But a cold frame is not the only way to keep food fresh during winter. In many traditional gardens, there is another method that is even simpler. Instead of building a structure above the soil, you allow the soil itself to become a natural storage system. The idea of letting the soil itself store food may sound surprisingly simple. In fact, many people hear about this technique for the first time and wonder if it could really work. Yet it is one of the oldest and most reliable strategies used in winter gardening. In many traditional farming communities, especially among Amish families, vegetables are not always harvested completely at the end of autumn. Instead, certain crops are left in the ground and harvested gradually throughout the winter. The reason this method works so well comes down to the natural insulating properties of soil. Even when the air above the ground becomes extremely cold, the temperature below the surface tends to remain much more stable. Soil holds heat that accumulated during the fall and releases that warmth slowly as winter progresses. This natural stability allows many root vegetables to survive underground, even when outside temperatures fall below freezing. However, gardeners usually add one more layer of protection to make this system more reliable. That protection comes in the form of deep mulch. Mulch can be made from straw-dry leaves or other loose organic materials. When spread thickly over a garden bed, mulch acts like a blanket that insulates the soil beneath it. It helps trap the earth's warmth and prevents frost from penetrating deeply into the ground. In many temperate climates, the mulch layer is usually around 8 to 12 inches thick. This depth is enough to provide insulation while still allowing gardeners to move the mulch aside when they want to harvest vegetables. Root crops are especially well suited to this method. Vegetables such as carrots, beets, turnips, and parsnips handle cold conditions remarkably well. When left in the ground under protective mulch, they can maintain excellent quality for months. One of the most satisfying experiences of winter gardening happens on a cold morning when you walk out to the garden and harvest fresh vegetables directly from the soil. All you need to do is push aside the straw with your hands and dig gently into the earth. Under the mulch, the soil often remains soft and workable, even in the middle of winter. Many gardeners who try this method for the first time describe the experience as discovering buried treasure. The carrots pulled from beneath the straw are often sweeter than those harvested earlier in the year. This sweetness is the result of the plant converting stored starch into sugar as temperatures fall. Of course, the success of this technique depends somewhat on local climate conditions. In regions with extremely cold winters, gardeners may need to apply a thicker layer of mulch. In some places, the mulch may need to be as deep as 18 inches to prevent the soil from freezing solid. If temperatures drop too low and the ground begins to freeze deeply, many gardeners harvest most of their root crops during late autumn while leaving a small portion in the ground for early winter harvest. The rest of the harvest can be preserved using another traditional method that has supported families through winter for centuries. That method does not take place in the garden itself. Instead, it usually exists beneath a house or in a cool, sheltered corner of a farm. It is the place where many traditional farming families store their harvest to last through the cold months. This method is known as a root cellar. The idea of a root cellar may sound old-fashioned, but it remains one of the most effective food storage systems ever developed. Long before modern refrigerators existed, families across Europe and North America relied on root cellars to preserve food throughout long winters. Small, cool rooms built underground or beneath houses allowed vegetables to stay fresh for months. The effectiveness of a root cellar comes from the stable environment it creates. Most root vegetables store best in conditions that are cool, dark, and slightly humid. The ideal temperature usually falls between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. High humidity prevents vegetables from drying out, while darkness helps slow down sprouting and spoilage. In many traditional farms, a root cellar can be as simple as a cool corner of a basement. Some families dig a small room into the side of a hill where the surrounding soil naturally keeps the space cool. Others even use large containers or sections of buried pipe covered with soil to create a stable storage environment. The key factor is not the complexity of the structure, but the ability to maintain consistent temperature and humidity. Modern gardeners can often start with simple solutions as well. An unheated section of a basement, a cool garage, or even a well-insulated space on the north side of a house can serve as a small root cellar. When the conditions are right, many vegetables can remain fresh for an impressive length of time. Potatoes are a classic example. Stored in a dark, cool place, they can last 4 to 6 months without much difficulty. Before storing them, potatoes are usually cured for about 2 weeks in a warm, dark space. This process toughens the skin and helps heal any small cuts that may have occurred during harvest. Winter squash is another excellent storage crop. Varieties such as butternut or Hubbard can last for several months when kept in a cool environment, with slightly lower humidity than root vegetables. Onions also store well when handled correctly. After harvesting, they should be dried in a warm, airy location until their outer skins become thin and papery. Once cured, they can be hung in mesh bags or braided and stored in a cool, dry area where they may last for several months. Carrots and beets harvested before the ground freezes can also be stored successfully. Many gardeners place them in boxes filled with slightly damp sand or sawdust. By layering the vegetables so they do not touch each other, they can remain fresh for an extended period of time. There is one important rule that traditional gardeners often repeat. Only the best vegetables should be placed into storage. Any roots that show damage or soft spots should be eaten first. One rotting vegetable can spoil an entire container of stored crops. In many farming communities, there is a simple saying that captures this idea. Store the best and eat the rest first. When gardeners combine cold, hardy crops in the garden, deep mulch beds, and root cellar storage, they can create a system that provides food throughout the entire winter season. But there is still one more technique I learned from observing Amish gardeners. It is so simple that the first time many people see it, they almost laugh because it appears too basic to work. This final method uses something that many farms already have in abundance: straw bales. Straw bales may not be the first thing that comes to mind when people think about winter gardening. Yet for many traditional gardeners, especially within Amish communities, straw is one of the most useful materials in the garden. It is commonly used for mulching and soil protection, but it can also become a surprisingly effective structure for protecting crops during cold weather. The concept behind this method is very simple. Instead of building a permanent wooden frame, the gardener places 4 or 5 straw bales on the ground in a rectangular shape. These bales create the walls of a small planting bed. The space inside the rectangle can be planted directly into the soil or filled with a mixture of garden soil and compost to create a fertile growing bed. Once the straw walls are arranged, the next step is to place a clear covering over the top. This cover might be an old window, a glass door panel, or even a sheet of heavy transparent plastic. The clear surface acts just like the lid of a traditional cold frame. Sunlight passes through the transparent cover and warms the air and soil inside the enclosure. What makes this system work so well is the natural structure of straw itself. Straw is made of hollow, dry stems that trap countless tiny pockets of air. These air pockets function as excellent insulation. The trapped air slows the movement of heat, which means warmth remains inside the structure longer during the night. In many cases, a straw bale frame can hold heat even more effectively than a wooden structure. During the day, sunlight warms the interior space. At night, the straw walls reduce heat loss and help maintain a more stable temperature. This simple insulation can protect plants through cold nights without the need for any artificial heat source. Another advantage of this method is its low cost. In many rural areas, straw is widely available and relatively inexpensive. With just a few straw bales and a piece of clear glass or plastic, a gardener can build a functional winter-growing structure in less than an hour. There is also an additional benefit that appears when spring arrives. Over the course of the winter, the straw bales slowly begin to decompose. When the season changes, the gardener can break apart the straw and spread it across garden beds as mulch for the summer crops. Nothing goes to waste. When I experimented with this technique in my own garden, the results were impressive. On winter nights, when the outside air dropped dramatically, the temperature inside the straw bale frame remained warm enough to protect the spinach and kale growing inside. Those plants continued to survive and provide fresh leaves throughout the cold season. This simple method reflects a broader philosophy that I observed while learning from Amish gardeners. They do not attempt to overpower nature with complicated technology. Instead, they observe natural patterns and design systems that work with those patterns. They grow crops that naturally thrive in cooler weather. They capture warmth from sunlight instead of generating heat artificially. They use soil and simple materials to protect their plants, and they store their harvest carefully so it can support their families through the winter months. When these techniques are combined, the garden is no longer limited to the short window of summer. It becomes a food system that can continue producing nourishment for much longer than many people expect. Winter may still be cold and challenging, but with the right approach, a garden can continue offering life even during the quietest months of the year. And sometimes that realization begins with a very simple question. Does the gardening season truly end when the first frost arrives?